Up to this point, when we've used either $.ajax or the load function to access the server, we've just supplied a URL. That URL was either a simple text file or a small JSP program. But we didn't pass any data to the program. But most real-life programs expect some input data. The server expects some input, and then it builds output based on what you supplied to it. And traditionally, that input has been in the form of name-value pairs, where the pairs are separated by an ampersand, and within each pair, the names and the values are separated by equal signs. And since that's the traditional format that browsers have used to send data to the server, most server programs have support for extracting the value of a particular parameter name. Now, up to this point, I've said when you try things on your own and you try exercises, you can just make a simple text field if you don't want to try to understand how my simple JSP examples work. This is no longer true. In order to read parameters, you have to have a real server-side program. Now, in real life, when you do a project, your company or your project will have specified a server-side environment. It may very well be Java, that's the most popular one, but it could easily be Ruby on Rails, it could be PHP, it could be .NET, and there's many others as well. So in that case, you'll learn that particular environment's way of reading the request parameters. And on big projects, the person who does the server-side code and the person who does the front end are often different people. But for practice, you have to have some way of doing this. So I'm going to supply an extremely simple JSP page that reads parameters. It's not going to do anything interesting with the parameters. It's not going to check for missing values. It's not going to do a lot of things that real server-side programmers do. But that's not important because you're learning the front end. But in order to practice sending parameters, you need to make sure you can get those parameters to the server and verify that the server received the parameters properly. So I'll make a very, very, very simple JSP program that reads some parameters, and you can just copy and use it directly. Okay, so if the server program expects some parameters, in particular if the URL that you refer to expects some input data, the way to supply that input data with $.ajax is with the property called data. And we'll see that there are various ways that you can build the value of the data property. It can be a string or an object, and we'll look at different ways of doing that in the upcoming sections. In particular, a string where you explicitly and specifically supply name-value pairs is equivalent to an object where the parameter names, the property names of the object become the parameter names, and the property values become the parameter values. And we'll look at both ways of doing it and assess the pros and cons of each. Okay, so let me briefly summarize the way that you can use the data property, and then we'll look at each of those three options in explicit detail with examples. So the simplest way to use the data property is you just supply a string that's in the format that the server expects, probably name-value pairs with ampersands between the pairs and equal signs between the names and the values. You, the JavaScript programmer, the jQuery programmer, you are responsible for building that string. A second way of doing it is to supply an anonymous object where the property names in the anonymous object become the parameter names, and the corresponding property values become the parameter values. And then you supply that anonymous object as the data property, and jQuery automatically converts that into a string that consists of name-value pairs with ampersands and equal signs. There's also a very interesting function, in fact this is my favorite approach, called serialize, that builds a parameter string kind of in one fell swoop from all the input elements in your form. So that's a very quick summary. I understand that's not enough detail for you to understand what's going on, but you can come back and refer to this later once you've seen the details for each of the three approaches. Before we go on and actually try it, I want to give a quick aside and look at two regular jQuery functions that will be commonly used when you're building data and sending it to the server. First is val, and the second is escape. So the idea is that val returns the value of an input element, probably a text field to begin with, but it could also be a radio button or a checkbox or a list box and so forth. And the parameters, the data that you send to the server, is usually based on something that the end user typed in. It's not usually a static value that's always the same. So you need to read the text field and put it into one of these strings or objects that you're going to send to the server. The problem is that when you call val, it returns the value from the text field exactly as the end user typed it in, which could include spaces, ampersands, and things that have special meaning in URLs. But the query parameter that's sent to the server can be part of a URL in a GET request, and even in a POST request, some special characters like ampersands have special meaning. So there's a function called escape that will convert that string into the format that can be allowed in URLs. And server-side programs know how to decode these values automatically. So let me show you a quick summary of the code, but then we'll try it interactively so that you can see it in a bit more detail. So suppose that you have a text field whose ID is some text field ID. If you put a # in front, hash, then that means an ID, and so jQuery can find it, and you call val, and that returns the text field value. But that returns the raw text field value exactly as the end user typed it in, including spaces and ampersands if there are any. So if you're going to then send that data to the server in a parameter string, you need to take the raw data that you just read and call escape. Notice that val returns a string. Most of the time, once you've used a jQuery selector and it matches potentially an array, but maybe an array of only one element, and you call a function on it, that function returns the original array so that you can do chaining. That's why we could do $, some selector, dot hide, and dot add class, dot remove class, and kind of chain them all together. But val is an exception to that rule. So val returns a string, and you couldn't do chaining any further after that. And I want to point out that val doesn't work only for text fields. It works for other input elements as well. Okay, so that's a kind of a quick summary, but the way to really get a handle on it is to try it out yourself and experiment. So let's do that. So let's practice using val and escape. So I have a text field in the page. Now, shortly, we'll use this text field in a complete working example. But for now, all we care is that it's a text field and that its ID is field1, all lowercase, all one word. So I bring up that HTML page in the browser. This top text field right here, that's the one whose ID is field1. And then I bring up Firebug. And let me verify that the ID of that text field is in fact field1. So I say # field1. Remember, # in CSS means an ID. And let's make sure that we find something. Yep, it finds something, an input field. And so now let's look up its value.val parentheses. I didn't type anything into that text field, so that should now be an empty string. But it wasn't an error. It found the value. The value was empty string, empty. So now let me type something into it. Hello. I run it, and it gets the string hello. But the problem is I could have special characters. I could say hello, space, ampersand, space, hi, space, ampersand, space, hola. And now if I go down and I read it, there are explicit spaces and ampersands in the string. But you don't want explicit spaces and ampersands in the value that the end user types in. Because if you mash it into a query parameter and has spaces and ampersands, those spaces and ampersands will have special meaning. You don't want them to have special meaning. You want it to just be the value of the text field. You don't want it to affect the overall URL. So you need to URL encode it, escape it before you send it to the server. And all server environments know how to get the values and then decode them automatically. So you need to call escape wrapped around the value. And so now the values are encoded in a special way. Exactly how they're encoded is a % followed by the ISO Latin 1 value of the character in hex if you really care, but you don't really care. You just need to know that's the normal format that you send data in URLs, and the server-side programs, whether they be .NET or Java or Ruby on Rails or PHP, know how to decode those values. So you need to call val to get the raw value, and then pass that value to escape, and that's the value that you're going to put into the parameter string that you're then going to send to the server.